Shalom, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for Liberalism's Crises in Israel and Elsewhere with Rabbi Dr. Yehuda Mirsky. And I also want to thank Temple Emmanuel in Denver for co-hosting today's program. Yehuda Mirsky is a professor of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies at Brandeis University and is on the faculty of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. He was in spring semesters of 2022 and 2023 a visiting professor at Harvard University, a native New Yorker who lives in Jerusalem with his family and is both an active scholar and committed activist. Rabbi Mirsky, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you, Alex, and your colleagues, and Reb Shmuley for providing this forum. So, hi everyone. Thank you very much for joining. You know, our world is pretty rocky these days, and it's funny when Alex and Reb Shmuley reached out to me to first talk about speaking to you all some months ago. It seemed the most obvious thing to talk about were sort of the democracy and judicial reform protests rocking Israel. That's such a huge deal. How could we not talk about that? And of course, since October 7th, life has thrown us some curveballs. I don't need to tell all of you. Even life's surprises and surprising crises take us where we are, right? And what is the society that was overtaken by the crisis of October 7th, and how did what preceded it affect it? I mean, one thing I'll talk about towards the end is ways in which, and often surprisingly helpful ways, in which the very fact of the democracy protest movement, about which more in a moment, in Israel helped fortify the country for what came after on October 7th and afterwards. But also, the rivets have been popping all over on what seemed to be a very familiar, we thought stable, we thought long-lasting world order. And it's worth looking, it's always helpful to notice what is going on in other countries, especially when there's all sorts of similarities and all sorts of differences. Um, I'm going to be talking about, obviously the emphasis is on the crises of liberalism in Israel, and especially the powerful arguments, really societally rocking society over the future of the judiciary, and the democratic system. And of course, I'm sitting in America now. You all are Americans. So America provides a really important, America is part of the story here, given America's outsized influence on Israel and so on. And also as an important comparative point of view. But I'm also going to want to take a look and see at what is going on, or just draw on some scholarship and generalizations about things that are happening elsewhere, because these liberal institutions and the stable American-led global order, et cetera, is in trouble in all kinds of places. And for each place, it's worth attending to what is shared, like what common features can we see, and then what are the distinctive local characteristics in each country, in each place. So for those of you who from maybe for worse or maybe for better, actually aren't obsessive followers of domestic Israeli news. So as you know, in the year 2000, before October 7th, the year 2023 was going to go down in history as the most contentious year in the history of Israeli domestic politics, because of a raft of legislative proposals to fundamentally remake Israel's judiciary. Fundamentally remake it, or fundamentally correct it where it has gone astray, depending on which side of the political aisle you found yourself. The new government, put together by Mr. Netanyahu, which took office in early 2023, from the get-go announced a whole series of proposals that would reshape the current form of the judiciary. It would and dramatically curtail the judiciary's ability to review legislation, change the ways in which judges were selected, and so forth. Now, this is a story that has been happening for some time. Um, and this has been brewing for some time, and some of the dynamics that we've seen um, are shared in Israel and the United States. So very briefly, we know that or you know that Israel does not have a written constitution, right? The United States famously has a written constitution. Israel does not have a written constitution, like Great Britain doesn't have a written constitution. What Israel does have is a series of very clumsily named basic laws. So you'll have something called basic law colon the judiciary, basic law the parliament, that sort of thing. At the same time, Israel historically has had a robust tradition of judicial review, much like not dissimilar to what we have in the United States. And of course, that's also because so much of the Israeli judicial system was created by the British during the years of the pre-state years of the British Mandate for Palestine, the years between World War I and World War II. And also because there are any number and any number of Israeli jurists were either American born themselves or spent time studying in America, and just sort of the broad influence of sort of Anglo-American jurisprudence was felt. And so say from early on in the history of the state, you had the Supreme Court say putting limits on the government's ability to restrict publications that were critical of the government. Now, a dramatic game changer here was in 1992. As I said, most of the basic laws are pretty basic, right? What will the Knesset, how many members are there in the parliament, and that kind of thing. 1992 saw the passing of a basic law called a Basic Law on Human Freedom, Human Dignity and Freedom. Chok Yisod Kvod Hadam B'Cheruto. Interestingly, this was passed with sort of bipartisan support, people both from the left and the right. And this basic law essentially enshrined in Israeli jurisprudence the idea that it incorporated into Israeli law fundamental principles of human rights that we find in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other instruments of international law. And also, crucially, it established that Israel's, this is something that was sort of implicit, but had not been said outright before, that Israel is to be a Jewish and democratic state, with Jewish and democratic on the same footing, right? Jewish and democratic on the same footing. And this, over time, gave rise to a very activist judiciary. The chief figure here is someone who you may have heard of named Aharon Barak, not Ehud Barak, the former prime minister, but Aharon Barak, a towering jurist, really very extremely brilliant and accomplished legal scholar, and who had also been legal advisor to the government, an attorney general, and one of the most important legal scholars of the day, well before he was on the court. And he is someone who was deeply influenced by American models of liberal judicial activism. And he interpreted this new basic law and its incorporation of fundamental principles of human rights and the idea of Israel being enshrined as a Jewish and democratic state as to be defined by the court, and he ran with it. So in addition to the strictly philosophical and jurisprudential arguments involved here, there's also a question of, so to speak, sociology and political sociology, which is to say, as I'm sure you know, the general tenor of Israeli politics and society has drifted rightward in recent decades. And all sorts of institutions that formerly had been staffed, so to speak, or under the authority of the founding elites of the society, who were, labor Zionist, social democrat, broadly politically liberal, etc., were increasingly under the control, by winning elections, nothing sinister about it, of the Israeli right, obviously the Likud party and so on. And then in terms of not just we're used to thinking of like separations of powers and checks and balances in institutional terms, but also sociologically, right? Israeli, what one important scholar has dubbed the former labor hegemons of Israeli society found themselves increasingly at a loss when it came to electoral victories and political standing and so on, but they still had the judiciary. In many respects, it's very similar to what has happened to American liberals over the years, right? American liberals, even back when I was in law school in the 1980s, there were some astute scholars who were pointing out that American liberals were sort of, so to speak, politically losing their muscle because they became very reliant on the judiciary just to provide whatever they wanted, whether they won elections or not. So at times, and then over time, because in a funny sort of interactive process, as Israeli politics, and especially in the settler movement, moved more and more to the right, the judiciary became increasingly assertive. And so if in America, for instance, in American law, we have a thing called political question doctrine, where the court will rule on whether, say, the Environmental Protection Agency has the authority to regulate the water table in some river that flows in between two states. But the American Supreme Court won't establish the appropriate level of the water table, right? They'll sort of they give deference to the judgment of the regulators of the EPA. And whereas under Justice Barak, when he was president of the Israeli Supreme Court, that's what they call Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Israel, they went much farther, and he, so to speak, and he thought it was the role of the judiciary appropriately to substitute its own policy judgment for that of elected officials and regulatory officials, and he was a magnificent enough legal scholar that he was able to do that at times very, very convincingly. And then there was this question of how do you square the Jewish and the democratic, right? Because, of course, to say that something is Jewish and democratic, well, it sounds very nice, but what sort of Jewish, right? For instance, there was a law that was also passed at some point saying that gaps in Israeli law were, when possible, to be filled by reference to the marvelous legal and moral and philosophical heritage of Judaism and Jewish culture. Well, that sounds great. But then, as a result, you had really interesting arguments between Israeli Supreme Court justices on what that means, right? If there's a gap if there's some issue in, say, the law of torts, right, the laws of civil damages, that is left unsettled by Israeli law, and there's an opportunity to sort of insert a new legal rule. Well, the Jewish bookshelf is large and capacious, and which book do I take off the shelf to look up? And some said, well, you look to Jewish legal literature, of course. There's this magnificent history of centuries and centuries of Jewish jurisprudence on civil and commercial and all sorts of other matters, right? So you just take a look at, say, the canonical code of the 16th century, Shulchan Aruch, right? And see what Shulchan Aruch had to say about that, and how that halacha has been understood and developed in subsequent centuries. And there you have your answer. And others, most prominently just the aforementioned Justice Barak, President of the Supreme Court, said, well, no, the books from the Jewish bookshelf that we should look at are the biblical prophets, the philosophers, modern Hebrew writers, and sort of in their great moral voices. Now, this is very appealing, but you could understand why what happens is, like, some of the crucial ambiguities in the very project of building a Jewish state then get put right into the judicial system. Over time, the Israeli judicial system it's an interesting thing. The Israeli judicial system, on the one hand, regularly showed great deference to the security establishment on all sorts of issues. At the other end, it did put genuine curbs on some of the more expansive ideas of the Israeli right, especially the settlement movement. In a very important case called the Katzir case, for instance, the Supreme Court ruled that you could not have that on land bought from required from the Jewish National Fund, on essentially public lands, you could not build a community for Jews only. And they did that by reference, also because this notion of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, they read it by reference to the Israeli Declaration of Independence, the Israeli Declaration, right? In the absence of a written constitution, the court increasingly had recourse to the Israeli Declaration of Independence, saying, the Israeli Declaration of Independence forthrightly says that it's the closest thing we have to a constitution, and it's the founding document of the state, and it forthrightly says that in Israel, all Israel's inhabitants and citizens will have equal rights regardless of race, gender, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These battles were long simmering, and by the way, there were powerful critics of Justice Barak who themselves were liberals, and they too had spent time studying American jurisprudence. And one of their concerns, you had people whose criticisms of Israel's judicial activism sounded like the ones we hear from American conservatives, right? Sort of, why are these unelected judges making law in the way that they are? At the same time, you also had people criticizing it from liberal terms, and bearing in mind, I mean, just a minor footnote of American legal history, some of the early critics of judicial activism in America were liberals, like Felix Frankfurter. And there the argument was that by extending the writ of the judiciary so much, you're subtly but inevitably undermining its legitimacy in the eyes of the public, and that's very much what happened, actually. Now, what brought this to a so over time, this developed more and more. And a very important bit of backlash happened in 2018 when Israel passed another basic law. The basic law, Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. This was meant to, in some respects, modify or push back that 1992 basic law. And it establishes that Israel is the nation state. The state of Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people and only of the Jewish people, right? Until then, Hebrew and Arabic were sort of all official. Had this rough parity, and establishes Hebrew as the official language, et cetera, et cetera. And it doesn't mention the word equality anywhere. What was happening also was that these trends towards taking the judiciary, limiting the role of the judiciary over time, right? These public political trends, and increasing public desire to limit the judiciary and to scale it back through legislative enactments and otherwise, found an unlikely ally in the person of Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, why do I say an unlikely ally? Because historically, the Likud party, starting from its pre-state days, as the revisionist party, as the revisionist movement, the revisionist Zionist movement, and its pre-state and its the incarnations in the early state years, as the Cherut party and eventually the Likud, all led by Menachem Begin, was a forthright, powerful champion of the judiciary and the rule of law, right? Because crucially, the revisionists you're sort of like liberal capitalist nationalists. They didn't like the idea of socialism. They very much liked the idea of private property, and they very much liked the idea of the judiciary and judiciary of the rule of law, and that was extremely important to them. And Netanyahu was like that. What changed were several things, and one thing, frankly, was that he began to come under criminal investigation himself. And also, over the years, he managed to alienate many of his political allies and proteges. And so increasingly, he found his political fortunes increasingly tied to people who would support him from the right and to the right of him, which is to say, religious Zionist settlers and hardline religious Zionist settlers, the ultra-Orthodox, with whom he developed incredibly close ties, etc. Now, while all this was going on, there was this large, moderate slice of Israeli society that in some respects was sort of asleep at the wheel. I mean, it was busy being high-tech nation. It was very post-ideological, right? Sort of in recent decades in Israel, much of the sort of the ideological fervor and a lot of the strong webbing of community that goes along with it had moved to the right. And in recent election cycles, it was kind of hard to understand what exactly the moderate center, who were like a huge number of people, what exactly they were standing for and what was their vision of the future. So Mr. Netanyahu comes into power at the beginning of 2020, at the beginning of 2023, and he and his allies, his justice minister, the chair of the Knesset, etc., the chairman of the Knesset Judiciary Committee, almost instantaneously push forward. They take every judicial proposal that they had been talking about in its most extreme version and put them forward all at once, right? So we will strip the court's ability to do judicial review. We will make the judicial appointment process entirely political, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was accompanied by a whole slew of other laws, some of which were clearly meant to, frankly, personally benefit politicians, say like a law that, it is okay for a politician to accept private donations, donations from private individuals. in order to finance his or her own legal bills and or medical expenses. Laws that were being floated that the country's electoral commission should be composed entirely of members of the coalition, and it should not be subject to any judicial review. I mean, so like there was this whole bunch of things that sort of taken together seemed to bespeak a massive change of the regime. Now, what was striking here is, as I said earlier, in order to be a critic of the judicial activism going on in Israel, you didn't need to be a crazy right winger or a cliched crazy right winger, because a lot of all sorts of people and thoughtful people, and I'd like to think I'm a thoughtful person too, had genuine criticisms of the Israeli judiciary, that it was a very insular institution, that it was overly activist, that it was getting away from public legitimacy, etc. But as is so often the case, a policy question that a policy illness that ought properly to be remedied with the surgical lancet or a scalpel is taken to with a meat cleaver. And the amazing thing was the remarkable response that this galvanized in Israeli society. So this I talked about this sort of sleepy, uncertain, broad, moderate center group of Israeli society that had kind of been asleep at the wheel or tending to its own garden in recent years came to life. And there arose this massive protest movement that went for 41 weeks straight until the outbreak of the present war, and was holding massive demonstrations every week and every week and every week. And it was in terms of given the relative sizes of the population, it was the numerical equivalent of millions of Americans protesting for weeks on it. And the protests weren't just in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, they were all over the country, in big towns and small towns, and different places had different characters. For instance, the Tel Aviv protest movement was by and large, not surprisingly, reflecting the demographics of Tel Aviv. Sort of it was like very secular, and at times, and sort of very in your face in the wonderful ways that Tel Aviv is very in your face. The Jerusalem protest movement, of which I was a part, was different. I mean, sort of we called our movement is called strengthening our shared home, and we very deliberately opted for a big tent. You have in it religious people like me, and people, ultra Orthodox people, and Arabs, and Mizrahi Jews, and so on and so forth. And so you saw this remarkable rebirth of civil society, this galvanizing, this organizing. And people starting to think really, really seriously, because people having the sense that Israeli democracy really, really mattered. And interestingly, if you would go to these protests, there were Israeli flags all over the place. Right? It was people, and here's sort of a contrast between a lot of it seems to me, a lot of the activism against that was, say, directed against the Trump administration, is people proudly claiming the mantle of Israeli patriots. Right? I am an Israeli patriot. I am the true Zionist. I am committed to this country, and that's why I'm fighting for this. Okay, and that's where the country was on October 6th, right? There was still, sort of one anecdote that I'll share in the Jerusalem movement. One of the things we did over the last holiday of Sukkot, we decided to do a series of dialogues in different, open your Sukkot conversation. And we managed to pull together something like 250 dialogue sessions all over the country, where people from different political and social groupings would come together and talk about the future of the country. And from what I saw and colleagues saw, and from the sessions that I facilitated, it was very clear to me that there was still tremendous grassroots solidarity. I would open these discussions by saying to people, open the zipper of your heart and tell me about a very Israeli moment in your life, a moment when you felt really like an Israeli. And a sort of fact pattern that would come up again and again and again would be like, I'd be standing in the supermarket with somebody, and I got into a conversation with the guy ahead of me online, and we got into a political discussion. It became a political argument, and we screamed our lungs out at one another for about 10 minutes. And then we were done, he said to me, "Hey, dude, can you watch my child in the carriage for a minute or two, because I need to get a bottle of ketchup?" And I'd say, "Sure." So at the grassroots level, one saw tremendous solidarity. But as you start moving up and outward towards the level of parties, institutions, and also social political currents and the social groups driving them, there you start finding great distrust and suspicion, hostility, much of it fanned also. What's going on? And what's going on? How does this relate? How does this compare and contrast to things going on in other countries, right? I mean, sort of, if we look at the United States, even the very fact of a comparison is odd because, you know, one of the things that the US and Israel have in common is that they view themselves as both very exceptional. American exceptionalism is this well-known thing, right? America's very different, right? America's different. And Israel too. Both U.S. and Israel see themselves as states whose own destiny has its own important place in world history. Both Israel and the U.S. see themselves as places founded in transcendent moral values. They see themselves as ideally as uniquely attractive to others around the world. They see themselves as states to whom the ordinary rules of decline don't apply. In Americans, because of like American destiny. In Israel, it's because of like messianic belief. And also both America and Israel have an interesting tendency to interpret criticism of them as criticism of some larger idea. If you're criticizing America, it's because you're criticizing freedom. If you're criticizing Israel, it's because you're criticizing Jews and Jewish self-determination. Now, they have good reason to think that, but it's sort of interesting because many terms, you know, if you criticize all sorts of countries around the world, if you criticize them, they don't say that, well, what you're really criticizing is a philosophical idea. No, you're criticizing them, right? Also, both America and the U.S. are deeply religious countries, right? They have larger degrees of religious affiliation and observance than in other OECD countries. Both countries have civil religions that draw on religion both places, right? In America, it says, "In God we trust" on the quarters. The president gets sworn in on a Bible, right? The chaplain opens up the Senate, etc. And Israel, of course, so much of Israel's society and its culture and its national symbols and its political identity is bound up with the ways in which it's interpreting Jewish history and religion. And it's also for both America and Israel, their own legitimacy as polities draws very heavily on religious ideas. Now, if we look at different places around the world, however, America and Israel aren't the only places where judiciaries have come under fire, right? Hungary, Poland, though Poland seems to be pushing back, right? So lots of countries in Latin America. So like liberal parliamentarism and presidentialism are under strain in a whole bunch of places. We see in a whole bunch of countries, we see the decline of political parties. We see the rise of oligarchical representative systems. We see social and economic inequality generating all kinds of populist resentments, etc. And we do see, I mean, here I very much like the work of two political scientists, Andrew Arado of the New School and Gene Cohen of Columbia. And he's originally from Hungary, Arado. And I very much like their book, Populism in Civil Society. Because we see it's a very well done analysis of certain features that we seem to be seeing in a number of countries, and also they do a great job of accounting for differences. So we talk a lot about the word populism. What do we mean by populism? We talk about it in the United States. So in a sense, it's an appeal to popular sovereignty as a fundamental norm, right? What gives legitimacy, right? What gives legitimacy? The fact that the government is accepted, is popular that it comes of the people, by the people, and the people want it. Now, what is this thing called the people? Well, there's this thing called the people, but you know, and you sort of thin out the understanding of the meaning of the people, so that you can say, well, it's this broad thing that encompasses. A feature of populism tends to be embodiment by a strong, charismatic leader. It sees society as divided between the masses and the elites. And there's a difference, and we use the word fascism a lot, but here, and I also like the work of a political historian and scientist named Ricardo Finkelstein, where he argues that indeed populism is, so to speak, like at the far end of versions of democracy. What makes the difference between populism and fascism, and again, none of these terms are like given to us by God. They're terms that people use to describe themselves, right? Mussolini happily called himself a fascist. You know, somebody like Huey Long in America happily called himself a populist. They're terms that we use, and at the same time, they're terms we use to try to explain things. And the difference between populism and fascism, in both cases, you have this notion there's the people versus the elites, there's the strong charismatic leader, etc. But in fascism has violence at its heart. The enemies, the enemies are physical enemies, right? It's not simply that there's people who have too much money in the society. There's people who need to be killed. Right, and this sort of permanent wartime mobilization is central to fascist societies. And there's also in fascist societies the sense that violence is somehow redemptive and ennobling. And I would argue that's where you see points of contact between far left revolutionary ideologies and fascism, right? The sense that violence is somehow redemptive, etc. But also as populism happens in countries, it happens in countries where there's such a thing as constitutions. Right? And in a truly fascist country, the Constitution is essentially meaningless. The Constitution is simply the ratification of the leader, right? In populist societies, they are still, again, they're along the democratic spectrum, and there's still such a thing as a constitution, still such a thing as some sort of sense of norms. And by the way, we can have populism on the right and populism on the left, and they regularly and it varies depending on who they define as the enemy, right? Is the enemy some sort of underclass, right? Racial, ethnic, religious minorities, immigrants, or is the enemy the elites, right? Now, crucially, this is a point that Arado and Cohn make, and just they put it very nicely. These are certain structural features. The things that give rise to populism are in some respects some of it arise from like tensions or contradictions that are in modern constitutional government, that are embedded in the system, that are supposed to be there in the system, right? We have representative democracy, but we also have an administrative state. We also have administrators who aren't elected, and we also have the judiciary who are largely unelected, right? So the separation of powers, it works well, but it also generates certain tensions and different ways of managing these tensions. But in different countries, it manifests different ways. And sort of what they call is the, back to the, if I just make clear about the structural issues, constitutional democracy can never be as fully representative as it aspires to be all the time. It just can't, right? There's no satisfying everyone all the time, right? And there will always be, political, cultural, or economic crises. So like when you have these crises between democratic government and when you have crises between like popular sovereignty and constitutionalism, there's something that the people want, but there's laws that are inhibiting what the people want, right? So a classical authoritarian, a dictator, will say, okay, the hell with the laws, and I represent the people, right? Populism tries to resolve that tension by saying, here I am, I'm now living a better version of democracy under the guidance of our leader. And then you have to rebalance the Constitution, right? So you can change the Constitution, you can change the composition of the courts, right? And that's what we saw happening. That's what we see happening in the US. That's what we saw happening in Israel. That's what we see happening in Hungary. What we see happening in Poland. But crucially, in each place, it's spoken in the political language of the place, and it's worth attending to the differences, right? Also, there's specific local characteristics. For instance, in America, a central feature of American life in recent decades is the tax revolt, right? The revolt against the very idea of paying taxes, right? It's very, just strictly as a political analyst matter. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that much of the elite of the Republican Party, their fundamental motivation is reducing taxes at all costs. And it could be for different sorts of reasons. It could be reducing taxes, obviously, for personal wealth. It would be to increase the scope but things like certain, there are some historians who will argue that much of the impetus for dramatic tax reduction in the United States came from people wanting to have private schools, and especially private segregated schools. And so you have to lower the tax burden in order to maintain the private segregated schools, et cetera. But there's all kinds of reasons why people, right? So that's something you don't have in Israel, for instance, right? In Israel, you don't have the tax revolt, right? In Israel, you don't have Hungarian nationalism, for instance, right? You don't have Magyar nationalism and its history and its long history of the sort that you have in Hungary. Crucially, what you have, though, in Israel is you have Zionism. And within Israel, much of the debate has been, who are the true Zionists? And here we increasingly and how do you understand the meaning of Zionism and its place in Jewish history also relates to debates about the meaning of democracy. And here I'm speaking in broad brush, gross generalizations, and speaking about religious Zionism, which is something I study a great deal and I've written a great deal about, etc. We look at the religious Zionists, the people who are behind the settlement movement, right, in the West Bank, and once upon a time the West Bank and Gaza, now simply in the West Bank. And there's this tendency in America to see them as like Bible thumping fundamentalists, right? Sort of that they seem that they're the Israeli version of American fundamentalists from the Midwest and the Bible Belt, and it's fundamentally mistaken. It's fundamentally mistaken because they see themselves as the true inheritors of Zionist revolution, right? They don't see themselves as simply like opening the book of the Bible and sort of translating it into contemporary politics, right? By their lights, politics is progressive, and they are progress. Zionism was part of a revolution through which God, acting through the Jewish people, would redeem the human race. And they are its vanguard. Right here I'm talking about the extreme versions of this, which happen to be in government now, especially Bezalel Smotrich, Israel's finance minister. Right? And so, as far as they're concerned, they are the true Democrats. They represent the will of the people. If you take a look, like in democratic theory, again, and I'm sure I'm doing injustice to the truth, but if we think of founding fathers of Republican thought, right? We have John Locke, who so deeply influenced America and the American framers, and we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? Locke was the key thinker behind, though he lived well before it. Both of them lived well before their respective revolutions. Locke is the key thinker behind the American Revolution, and Rousseau is the thinker behind the French Revolution. And for Locke, the social contract is fundamentally a contract of individuals with individuals with individuals with individuals, right? I contract with each one of you here on this Zoom, and you contract with me, and we all contract with one another, right? In this endless, right? And we fundamentally retain our individuality, and so much of the point of the political system is to retain our individuality, including our property. For Rousseau, like democracy is the general will. I mold myself into the general will. Democracy is the will of the people taken together, which also creates the nation. And as far as he's concerned, that is the way to curb egoism, right? That's his positive argument for that. So if you listen to the legal scholars on the Israeli right, supporting the dramatic scaling back of the powers of the judiciary, and you ask them for their philosophical views, that's what they'll tell you. Democracy represents the will of the people. What is the will of the people? A unitary thing? Aren't there compromises? Of course there's compromises. There are the compromises of the governing coalition. The compromises of the governing coalition are the sum total of legitimate compromise in the society. Right? It's this very Rousseauist conception, in which sort of like the will of, but then when allied to Jewish religion, the will of the people, and especially if it's the will of the Jewish people, becomes the will of God. Right? And so much of the challenge of the opponents of this, and I think it's a challenge that's going to grow in coming years, is going to be about how do you create some sort of alternative conception of Jewish peoplehood, right? That does, if like me, you don't think that's a good way to run a polity. What sort of alternative conception are you going to make? Because, and then just one or two points, then we'll have time for questions. See, because Zionism itself, Zionism arose, like so many Jewish political and religious movements in modern times, arose as a response, by the late 19th century, everybody was talking about the Jewish problem, right? There was this Jewish problem. So, the jokes about the elephant and the Jewish problem and all. And as the great Zionist thinker and essayist Ahad Ha'am once pointed out, the Jewish problem is really two problems: the problem of Jews and the problem of Judaism. How are Jews going to deal with their social and economic and political challenges, above all anti-Semitism, in the distinctive features of the modern world, when Jews no longer have self-government, society is no longer run by kings and queens, the church is no longer calling the shots in the West, right? And at the same time, the problem of Judaism. Why go on being Jewish? Why care about this? Why go on maintaining a Jewish identity after the end of traditional Jewish community, after the attacks of modern science and philosophy on traditional religion? And all of Jewish history, all of modern Jewish history, is a series of mixing and matching efforts to deal with this, right? So Zionism has its answer to Jewish political, social, and economic disability, and then offers different cultural answers. Right? Reform Judaism has its answer to the question of Jewish political, social, and economic disability, and also its set of cultural and religious answers, et cetera, et cetera. So the founders of Zionism, the labor Zionists who I mentioned, the ones who I seem to casually dismiss as former labor hegemons, created a movement that had a powerful interpretation of Jewish history, right? Where they with great conviction and learning, whatever, argued that they were the true inheritors of Jewish history, even as they were rebelling against so much of the tradition, right? And they created this powerful civic religion, and this powerful network of institutions and of symbols and ideas that sort of that reinforced one another. And over the decades, that went, right? In part is because it lost touch with traditional sources of Jewish culture. And so as a result, for instance, when you have religious Zionists who see themselves as the inheritors the true inheritors of the socialist Zionists, because they are still deeply committed to the Zionist revolution against like traditional Jewish history and to the negative forces of the world, right? And they're speaking an ideological language that much of Israeli society no longer speaks, not to mention the entrance into Israeli politics and society of groups that were not part of that initial Zionist governing ethos, which is to say Mizrahi Jews and ultra-Orthodox Jews, right? And the mass Jewish migration from Russia, and of course the mounting salience of Israel's conflict first with the Arab states, and then with the Palestinians. And so there's this acutely, pardon the word, dialectical relationship, right? Between, Israel's not the only place in the world where a secular revolution seems to end up in a generation or two later being run by religious people, right? You see it in Algeria, you see it in all kinds of places. And that's also because the revolutionaries are themselves intensely tied to the tradition. Now, one thing, and then with this I'll stop. In Israel and in the US, and I would argue elsewhere, a fundamental challenge is that liberalism in a globalizing age has a very hard time providing solidarity and making strong arguments for solidarity. Why should I care about people who aren't my children having health care? Why should I care about people who disagree with me when I can live nicely in my own enclave, whether it's an enclave, whether it's an enclave in a liberal town or in a conservative town, right? From where will derive, I mean, by now the cliche in America for 2020 cliche, but it's true, right? So the decline of bowling teams and everybody bowling alone. Because crucially, where can I find the communal base of values, right? That will enable me to develop myself as a person and withstand the violence of dogmatisms coming from right and left. I mean, I think that's a fundamental challenge facing liberalism, both in Israel and in the U.S. And what was so interesting in the democracy movement before the war was this ethos finding itself. And then the two last comments: what happened on October 8th to the democracy movement? Well, on October 8th, the democracy movement turned on a dime to start taking care and providing all the services that the government wasn't providing, right? The $800,000 that American Jews have very generously given to Israel since the start of the war to fund all kinds of social service things that the government isn't funding are going through these civil society organizations. I can tell you the protest movement, the wing of the protest movement that I was involved in, I flipped on my phone in the morning of October 8th just to see where everyone is and how everyone's doing. And on, in the protest movement WhatsApp group, somebody said, "Hey, there's a youth hostel in Jerusalem that's taking in people who have been evacuated from the south that need money. What can we do?" And by the end of the day, we had a fundraising campaign going. And you saw this all over the place, right? And one last thought, is that maybe liberal isn't the right word here anymore. Maybe we need to talk about humanism, putting people first. Maybe because liberalism has come to mean this very atomized, very separate kind of thing, right? Neoliberal economics is about making everybody stand on their own boat, which turns out to be not unhelpful and a recipe for turning the working classes into hardcore populists, right? Liberalism has come to mean certain lifestyle choices, etc. But that it doesn't necessarily entail a deep concern for other people. So I think the same way like the institutions that educated us are really important, but the values we were taught there are more important than the institutions that taught them to us. Maybe the things we're trying to further with this term liberalism, or we're trying to further with this term liberalism, could be better served by some other conceptual framework. And also, one last thing that let's just say the founders of the liberal tradition in its best sense were deeply religious people. So I'm not saying that people need to start becoming Orthodox or something in order to be good liberals. To the contrary, but there's something about liberalism finding deep foundations, like the ethos and the way of life that we tend to think of as liberal as sort of as trying to be non-dogmatic and non-violent and open to a broad range of options for how to lead a good life. At the end of the day, it does require some foundational beliefs. And I actually think an important direction for future Jewish thought is to take as our starting point, what are the core beliefs that I need in order to make a decent social, ethical order possible? And then start from there in a self-critical way, right? Bearing in mind that it's not just me always, taking whatever I happen to agree with and assuming, well, God must agree with me too. So I hope we have time for questions, and you've been very patient, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Mirsky. Yes, absolutely. We have some time left that we can open it up to questions. Please feel free. If you would like to ask a question, you can raise your hands and we can call on people. And we can also use the chat. I see there's already one question in there, so we can start with that.
Right. So the question, very good question. We often assume that the growth of science and technology leads to the decline of religion, but how might the advent of digital technology foment the religious fervor that is presently unsettling liberal democracy? That's an excellent question. First off, the growth of science and technology turns out doesn't necessarily lead to the decline of religion. Right. I mean, one of the, there was this American social science in the post-war years was utterly consumed or utterly ruled by this thing called the secularization thesis, right? And the idea that secularization, sort of by secularization we mean, the removal of religion from a position of authority in society. Religion becomes optional, right? And under control of the government, that this is some sort of inevitable process, and it turns out that it wasn't, right? That's why things like, say, the Iranian Revolution took everybody by surprise. That's the rise of the moral majority in the United States took everybody by surprise, and religious Zionism, et cetera, et cetera. So science, I mean, in many respects, technology is morally neutral, and people can use it for whatever ends they use it, right? One thing, though, and this is a point that Arado and Cohen, these political scientists who I mentioned, they make about, say, about to your question of digital technology, especially social media, the very structure, right? Marshall McLuhan famously said the media is the message. Social media is very decentralized, or at least in terms of its user base, right? In some respects, part of what's been going on in the arguments in the last few days in Congress with TikTok is you have this thing that's seemingly diffuse and everywhere, and you have TikTok creators saying, no, but this is just me sitting in my office or in my home, and this is how I earn my living through this platform. But this platform is controlled very centrally in Beijing. But at least seemingly the diffuse and decentralized structure of social media correlates nicely. It's well suited to populism's non-elitist, always shifting conception of this broad diffuse thing of the people, right? The New York Times is very easy to see as an elite institution because it's a huge gatekeeper, right? And if you can, anybody who's ever tried to get anything published in the New York Times, the Washington Post or whatever can attest to how hard it is to make it into that platform. And so there is this social media in particular has this way of, again, sort of swamping or swarming around or engulfing, overwhelming the elite control, or hitherto understood elite control of opinion and ideas. But of course, these entities are subject are being controlled by people themselves, right? Obviously, whether an extreme version, say in TikTok, right? The extreme version is you actually have a bona fide dictatorial regime, right? Calling the shots. When you if somebody looks at something on their phone on TikTok, it's because, in a matter of speaking, somebody in Beijing thought that's what they should be seeing. But even say with American held companies, Google, Facebook, that sort of thing, it's the imperatives are determined by the interests of the shareholders, by the owners, right? As we talk about artificial intelligence these days, the journalist Ezra Klein had what I thought was a marvelous observation. He said, we can argue back and forth whether or not ChatGPT is a good thing for the human condition or not. It may not be, but maybe we could all agree that the way to make a decision about this as a society isn't just to let Google and Facebook run with it and see if they can make money. There's something about social media that on the one hand does provide a platform, etc., does enable voice for people who didn't have voice. The question is is it a simulacrum of that? Is it is it real or is it Memorex? How real a voice or is it virtual? When things are being algorithmed all the time. And there's one other point I have to make, and this is as much a religious point as it is anything else. I've long thought, if the devil has a business model, it looks an awful lot like social media today, because the angrier you are, the more money you make. I and some colleagues in Israel, especially there's a group now called Hasmol Ha'emuni, so to speak, the faithful left. It's an attempt to reconstitute a religious left, not a religious left unlike religious observance, women's prayer groups and that sort of thing, but rather a religious voice on matters of politics, economics, and society. One of the things we've been talking about is that, for a long time, Jewish political thought and Jewish religious left thought has been trying to do the thing of, well, let's find the line in Maimonides that sounds like John Locke. Maybe we're barking up the wrong tree. Maybe what we need to do is go back to the resources of the Jewish religious tradition on what it means to be a moral person and to lead a moral life, and sort of rebuild our thought from there. What is Netanyahu's future now? Well, Mr. Netanyahu is ruled out at one's peril. Let's put it like this with Mr. Netanyahu. Mr. Netanyahu is a very brilliant and talented man. Part of why he was able to be in power for so long is that in many respects, he's been a stuck man for a stuck country. Netanyahu has always avoided, almost except on certain economic issues, always avoids large and difficult decisions. He's not a warmonger, right? This is the first real war he's ever had to preside over, even though he had opportunity to go to war any number of times in the past. He's extremely cautious. He's extremely risk averse, Netanyahu. So that's also why he always reverses himself from news cycle to news cycle to news cycle to news cycle. There's something about his stuckness and his inability to take large decisions actually did reflect much of what was going on in the Israeli polity as a whole. Everyone was comfortable with not having to take large decisions. I have to confess, in retrospect, we're all piling on Netanyahu for like, how could you just let Gaza simmer like this for so long? I think I'm one of the people who tacitly went along with it because you kind of knew that really intervening in Gaza and dealing with Hamas would entail the kind of horrible military, immense military operation with all the horrible human suffering that it entails, right? So Mr. Netanyahu is not to be counted out. Also, he himself is at a place where he truly sees no distinction between his personal interest and the national interest. Like they really are one and the same. And at the same time, his coalition partners, precisely because, I'm talking about the people who were with him from the beginning, not the people who joined under the press of wartime in order to have adult supervision in the cabinet room. Precisely because they know that if an election were held tomorrow, they'd all be out of office. They are holding on to one another for dear life. Right? Benjamin Franklin, at the time of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, famously was said to have remarked, "Well, gentlemen, we will all hang together, or certainly we shall all hang separately." Right? And so his coalition partners really want to hang on because they know that if the election is tomorrow, they're done. And so it's, as much as one personally would like to see Mr. Netanyahu go, it's probably always too easy. You can't ever assume that, well, you can never assume, well, he's just going to go quietly into that good night. Right? And unseating him will take an awful lot of work because he does have ironclad control over his party. And which is kind of remarkable. It's sort of, and this gets back to this question of personal virtue. You look at some of the people following Netanyahu, and they were very brave soldiers, or they were brave dissidents under the Soviet Union. And yet there's something about him that, like, so then why are they scared of him if they weren't scared of, Syrian anti-tank missiles or being interrogated by the KGB? As often it's like one has to maintain like a strong, I don't want to say ideological, but a value-based position and an interest-based position, right? Part of what's going to make this hard here is that for many people on the Israeli right, there's people I know, including relatives of mine, who they don't trust a word out of Netanyahu's mouth. They think he's a terrible person. They think he's a terrible leader. They can't stand the sight of him, but they'll vote for him because they know he would rather die than establish a Palestinian state. And one of the things that helps keep, and I know this may not sound appealing, but one of the people, Palestinian rejectionists have done a marvelous job also of keeping Netanyahu in power. Anytime, the fact that like when Israel does something that upsets the Palestinian Authority, so every time rather than saying, we appeal to you, broad Israeli moderates, we want to work with you to build a better future for our children and our grandchildren, rather than do that, they run to the UN and say, we have to condemn Israel. Israel's terrible. Israel's horrible. Israel's awful. And that just convinces more people to vote for Netanyahu. Oh, so Netanyahu must be right when he says everybody hates us and they're always against us. Right? I used to work in the Human Rights Bureau of the U.S. State Department. I'm deeply committed to these things. Yeah, I kind of knew that once Israel started this war in Gaza, once Israel started its military operations in Gaza, of course it was going to be accused of genocide. Right? How could it not? And the problem is, somebody like me, I hear that, I take it in stride, and I say, okay, but I still believe in international law. I still believe in human rights. We somehow have to persevere in this thing. But for so many, even well-intentioned moderate Israelis, then who needs this? Who needs this? And also Rabbi Perlmutter asks, what is liberalism's future in Israel? Who knows? One thing I think I can say is that attempts simply to transplant American liberalism to Israel don't work. Same way there have been attempts, there are attempts to transplant American conservatism to Israel, and they've been having some success. But attempts simply to translate American liberalism to Israel doesn't work because, again, Israel is a society premised on tremendous solidarity. You tell people in Israel that there's people in America who don't have health insurance, and they literally do not believe you, right? They can't understand how could that be, right? Um, Sort of, religion state separation like we have in the United States. It's, again, I'm a very vocal critic of the rabbinate in Israel, but it doesn't quite work that way. In religious terms, the American denominational structure, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, doesn't work in Israel, right? Um, but I do think, I mean, there's something like nicely liberating about that slightly pessimistic message of mine, because the same way American liberalism is run aground on hard times, and I think we all need to dig deep and rethink ourselves and rebuild ourselves from the ground up. I think for Israeli liberals, that's the truth too. There's one bright spot, and with this I'll close. I mean, the one bright spot in the fact that liberalism is under challenge so many places, it shows that this struggle for what we think of as like trying to create decent societies that fundamentally respect human dignity and liberty, and is a shared struggle in different countries, and we need to learn from one another as we try to go about doing it, each in our own local circumstances, local ways.
Thank you
Thank
so
you all.
much. Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you so much, Rabbi Mirsky. It was a pleasure to learn with you. Thank you all
That's
for
very
being
good to
here
say.
today. And thank you all again. Have a great rest of your day.